Thanks for being with us here on Live Now from Fox. I'm your host, Christina Evans. We do want to continue on covering some of our nation's top stories, and we're going to be keeping a close eye on the Trump administration at this time. So big news this week. We know that Harvard University is currently in a standoff with President Trump after rejecting a series of demands from the president's administration, which critics are now viewing as an attack on the college for its reputation among conservatives as those also pushing for liberal thought. We do want to check in right now with Fox's Rebecca Castor. She has much more on this story and what direction we're headed.
Large protests resuming at Harvard this week as the nation's oldest university goes head-to-head with the White House over its handling of pro-Palestinian protests.
You shouldn't have the government coming in and telling a private institution what it can do in its internal affairs like that.
I think Harvard is faced with a choice, and it seems like they're making the wrong choice, which is to double down on these crazy ideas that most Americans don't agree with.
The Trump administration says Harvard did not do enough to keep Jewish students safe. Now the Department of Homeland Security is threatening to prevent the university from enrolling international students unless it hands over the names and records of those who participated in campus protests. And the IRS is considering revoking Harvard's tax exemption status, which saves the school an estimated $465 million a year.
Harvard has a pretty big endowment. And I think that, taxpayers across the country are looking at this over $50 billion endowment and saying, why are our tax dollars going to some of these elite universities that aren't even protecting their students on campus?
Harvard claims there is no legal basis to take away its tax-exempt status and says it's already taken action against anti-Semitism on campus.
I find that, criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic, and, we should be protecting free speech.
Adding to this feud, the White House claims Harvard has not properly reported its foreign funding sources and is demanding the university resubmit records. In Washington, Rebecca Castor, Fox News.
Our thanks to Rebecca Castor for that information as we're taking another live look there at the White House. Of course, what we're finding out is that after cutting off that funding, President Trump has reportedly given the Internal Revenue Service, also known as the IRS, a potentially illegal order to revoke the university's tax-exempt status. It'll be an interesting thing to see how this plays out. I do want to put up this response that we have there from President Trump that he posted on his Truth Social page, saying perhaps Harvard should lose its tax-exempt status and be taxed as a political entity if it keeps pushing political, ideological, and terrorist-inspired, supporting, quote, sickness. Remember, tax-exempt status is totally contingent on acting in the public interest. We want to dive into this story a bit more and find out what is the precedent in this situation. To do so, I want to bring in Phil Hackney, the professor of law at the University of Pittsburgh. Phil, thanks so much for being with us here on Live Now from Fox.
Thanks for having me, Christina.
Let's just start off with the very basics here, Phil. What gives a university here in the United States tax-exempt policies? Can you sort of talk about what that looks like, why it's been like that, and how long we've had these policies so far?
Yeah, since our Internal Revenue Code was enacted in 1913, and really a bit before, we've had the concept that organizations that are organized and operated exclusively for charitable purposes, which can include scientific and educational, religious, are exempt from the federal income tax. The idea is that these organizations are carrying on things that are important to our communities in a variety of different ways. These are our churches, our hospitals, our universities that we depend upon to advance research, that we go into worship and they take care of our sick. And we have long held that these organizations should be exempt from the income tax. There are other elements of it, which is we want to protect the freedom of speech and freedom of association of these organizations. These organizations are also part of civil society and a bedrock of a democracy. So this has been in place for a long time. Harvard's been exempt since the beginning. The idea of removing it is really kind of earth-shattering, I would say. It's a stunning move. Given our long expectation that organizations that educate the public are charitable and exempt from the tax.
And I want to also put up a portion of the response that Harvard also put out to President Trump. This is from their president, Alan Garber. He says, quote, this, the administration's prescription goes beyond the power of the federal government. It violates Harvard's First Amendment rights and exceeds the statutory limits of the government's authority under Title VI, excuse me. And it threatens our values as a private institution devoted to the pursuit, production, and dissemination of knowledge. No government, regardless of which party is in power, should dictate what private universities can teach, whom they can admit and hire, and which areas of study and inquiry they can pursue. So very interesting to hear this response as well. I want to focus on the first part of that statement, though, saying that it violates Harvard's First Amendment rights and exceeds the statutory limits of the government's authority. What are your thoughts as you hear that? Do we have any legal precedents in this category?
Yeah, so the idea of revoking an exempt status because of the character of the speech of Harvard would clearly be a rule based on speech and association. And would seem to me to violate the Constitution. Now, part of our difficulty is we don't know exactly why the IRS would revoke the exempt status of Harvard. We would need to see those reasons. Typically, if the IRS were to revoke an exemption, it would have engaged in a long process where it would have been auditing Harvard over months and built an administrative record to look at all the facts and circumstances. This seems to be focused solely on some aspect of the speech of Harvard that the president does not like. That is something that the First Amendment protects, and civil society is there to be a bedrock and a bulwark against those types of threats. So I do believe this implicates freedom of speech. If you recall back in 2013, when everyone was very upset with the IRS for targeting the Tea Party groups, the principle there was correct. The president and the IRS shouldn't be involved in determining what type of speech people engage in. With the president particularly directing this, I find I'm deeply concerned about this chilling of speech here.
And as we're taking this other live look that we also have there at the White House, we do know that how President Trump decided to react in this situation. They've already frozen $2.2 billion in grants and another $60 million in multi-year contracts to Harvard as well. Do you think that this is also something that Harvard could push back on in a legal sense to have that money opened back up to the school? Of course, we'll also talk about the incredible endowment that Harvard University has. But first, focusing on the fact that the grants have been frozen at this point, is this something that the school could push against?
Yeah, I mean, if there has been a law passed that includes a budget that includes money going to Harvard, there are good reasons to argue that those monies are due. Additionally, if the choice to revoke those grants was based on speech, you're imposing a speech requirement which the First Amendment would not allow. So I do think there are possibilities there for Harvard to challenge that. And many groups have been, including universities, colleges and universities, have had success in challenging some of the pulling back of the NIH grants and the NSF grants. These were substantial hits. These are dollars that have been going to universities to carry out research that the US government has been directing them to do. So I do think they have an opportunity to challenge that, and some universities have successfully done that. I would note it is a particularly large endowment, and I'm certainly one to critique the area of philanthropy and charitable. It tends to have a strong weight towards those with wealth. But attacking it in this way, I think, is going about doing it the wrong way. I think we have to be thinking about other methods rather than ones that really go to the heart of freedom of speech and freedom of association. These are kind of very concerning trends right now.
I'm also interested in here to see where this potentially could go, because just based off of history, we do know that back in 1983, the Supreme Court upheld a lower court's decision that the IRS could deny tax-exempt status to Bob Jones University. This is a private Christian university that banned interracial dating and marriage on campus. So when we're talking about this, it's not exactly in the same vein as far as maybe violating some of those other constitutional rights. But truly, can we look at this in any way to see how we may be seeing this go through the legal system, potentially all the way up to the Supreme Court?
Yeah, I think the Bob Jones precedent is super important to take into consideration here. So this took place in the late 70s, the Carter administration, after many years after Brown versus Board of Education, a Civil Rights Act in the 1960s, and the president's, the executive branch, engaging in decisions that discriminating on the basis of race was wrong. The IRS promoted guidance first and stated that discriminating on the basis of race could no longer support a charitable institution. And after that, they examined Bob Jones. At the time, Bob Jones, as I understand it, had discriminated on the basis of race in terms of admissions. They later ended that, but they continued to maintain this prohibition on interracial dating. And on that basis, the IRS revoked the status after many years. And then Bob Jones fought that. And there were definitely issues of First Amendment there. Freedom of religion was involved in that consideration, as well as speech and association. But the court found that it was reasonable to bring into the notion of charitable purpose the idea that a violation of a fundamental public policy could be grounds for rejecting that organization as charitable. It could no longer get the benefits that come with that. So I think the way to think about that instance and this instance is that if there is concern regarding whether it's diversity, equity, and inclusion, or the way Jewish students have been treated, reasonable concerns, there should be an audit of Harvard. An administrative record should be developed. Harvard should have an opportunity to have conversation back and forth. Realistically, too, the IRS and the Treasury Department should make it clear what the rules are under which we're operating. If we change rules in midstream, it's problematic. In the Bob Jones situation, the rules weren't changed midstream. It was a long process to get there. Here, we're kind of changing policies overnight. That's of real concern.
All right, and I also still want to put up this tweet that we have there from the account there. This one, we're going to start with this one by former President Barack Obama. He's quote tweeting what Harvard University also said on their X account. They said Harvard said no government, regardless of which party is in power, should dictate what private universities can teach, whom they can admit and hire, and which areas of study and inquiry they can pursue. We put up a portion of that statement earlier, but here's former President Obama's response. He says Harvard has set an example for other higher ed institutions rejecting an unlawful and ham-handed attempt to stifle academic freedom while taking concrete steps to make sure all students at Harvard can benefit from an environment of intellectual inquiry, rigorous debate, and mutual respect. Let's hope other institutions follow suit. And I think the interesting thing here as well, Phil, is the fact that we do know that the Big Ten, they've decided to come together and an academic portion, all 10, we may be used to seeing them for sports teams. They're always battling each other out on the field. But coming together academically, deciding that if President Trump decides to come after any of them in his administration, that they will some sort of way band together to fight this. What are your thoughts on that? Is this something that we've seen before as well?
I feel like we're in new territory here in the United States with these kinds of threats. I mean, we've perhaps seen such things in the Red Scare back in the 50s when there was a Committee on Un-American Activities. But this is a greater threat in some ways because it's happening at the federal government level and they are denying it in the executive branch. I study nonprofits and civil society. Civil society are these places where we all meet to talk about the issues that we face in our churches, at ball games, at our universities. And we talk about what is important to us. And the only way to really defend those things is to have solidarity on this notion that we each should be able to have the thoughts that we have, express them, worship the way we want, think the way we want, write the things the way we want. If we don't have that, we're in great danger of losing a democracy. And in my opinion, this should go across ideological lines. This is consistent with kind of the grounds upon which the United States was founded, to have that freedom of speech, have that freedom of association, and have that freedom of religion. It's of real concern. If Donald Trump is able to have his administration pull groups that he does not like, what's going to happen when, whether it's a Kamala Harris, a Barack Obama, or whoever it might be tomorrow, Elizabeth Warren, who knows? We shouldn't want them pulling churches or pulling other ideological groups that are dear to their interests. So I do believe there's an interest in seeing solidarity, not on the content of the speech, but on the right to speak, on the right to associate, on the right to worship.
And it will be something that we're continuing to follow here on Live Now from Fox. Phil, before I let you go, any final thoughts on things we should be looking out for in the next week or two? If any changes are made, what are some of those things that we should be truly trying to pay attention to see where this potentially is going?
Yeah, I think the biggest concern, in my opinion, is if the administration immediately revokes the exempt status of these organizations without actually going through and doing due process. Charities are owed due process. That's another fundamental element. So if we see organizations having their status removed next week, there's a lot of harm that comes with that. If Harvard has its status pulled next week, that blows up all sorts of arrangements like its tax-exempt bonds and causes a lot of chaos throughout society. So I think watching to see if they pull it immediately or if they start having the IRS do audits and investigate these organizations and go through the normal process that allows the democracy to work together to resolve these issues rather than pulling an organization's status at one president's whim.
Well, we certainly appreciate your time here on Live Now from Fox. Phil Hackney, professor of law at the University of Pittsburgh. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Christina.